Soldier, Mage, King, Chapter 14. The Curse of Cornelius Sigan, Part 2. Merlin shot upright, a scream pulling at her lips. Terror washed through her in waves. She had no idea why. The moon peered down at her from her window. She scrambled out of bed and down the short flight of stairs to Gaius's workshop, where he slept on the cot used for patients. Except he wasn't asleep either. He was sitting up, his head in his hands, which were shaking. "What just happened?" Merlin asked, her voice shaking.
"I'm not sure, but you should get dressed. I fear the night's troubles are just beginning,"
Gaius said, looking up and noticing Merlin still in her shift. She nodded and rushed back upstairs, dressing quickly. Gaius was pacing by the time she finished with the laces on her corset. He opened his mouth to speak when the bells began to ring. Merlin ran out the door. She had to find Arthur. She did, at the entrance to the tunnels, where they'd uncovered Sigan's tomb. He was checking one of the guards. Merlin quickly turned to the other. "Alive, just asleep," Merlin confirmed. Then something caught her eye. A still slightly smoking, burned bag, like the one she'd found in the stables earlier that day. "And that's why," she said, pointing it out to Arthur. He swore. "What happened?" she asked.
"The tomb was broken into. Someone seems to have stolen the largest jewel, though nothing else was taken from the looks of it,"
Arthur said, shaking his head. A small platoon of guards had arrived. Arthur directed half of them to secure the tomb, while the others were set to the task of getting the unconscious guards to Gaius. "I'll show them where the traps are," Merlin said, and Arthur hesitated but nodded as he turned, needing to report this theft to his father. As Merlin showed the guards where not to step, she spotted something. A large diamond heart on the floor of the tomb. It had once been a sparkling, swirling blue. She didn't point it out to anyone, but she did race off to find Gaius as the sun finally peeked over the horizon.
"Then Sigan is free. He could be anyone,"
Gaius said as he checked to ensure that the guards were still out cold. "Not quite. Only 4 people at best have access to the keys. The guards said the lock wasn't tampered with. They had to either have magic or the keys."
"The ones Arthur keeps in his nightstand?"
Gaius asked, and Merlin nodded. And the only people who have access are Arthur, myself, Galahad, and Arthur's usually hypothetical manservant, Merlin said, ticking off people on her fingers.
"Usually hypothetical?"
Gaius questioned. Merlin nodded. "He's hired someone for pretending to save his life. I saved his life," Merlin muttered, glancing at the guards who hadn't moved. "Oh, gods. That's it. He's the thief." Merlin took off at a run before Gaius could get a name out of her. Galahad stared down at the straw-strewn floor of the dungeon. He was being held on suspicion of thievery. He'd been arrested around midday when Cedric, Arthur's new manservant, had pointed the finger at him. Now the sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting depressingly dark in the dungeons. "Galahad," a voice called, and he looked up, scrambling up as he spotted Merlin in the dim light of the sputtering torches. "Merlin, I swear I didn't," he began, but she shook her head. "I know you didn't, but I think the thief got more than they bargained for. Who accused you?" she demanded. "Cedric, Arthur's new manservant. He wasn't acting the same, though. And for a moment, I could have sworn his eyes were pure black," Galahad said, lowering his voice. "I believe you," she said, her expression hardening. "I'll get you out of here, I swear." Dust rained, and the castle shook. Galahad's eyes went wide.
"What's happening?"
Galahad asked. Merlin shook her head. "Nothing good," she intoned before taking off up out of the dungeons. She did not want to speak to the dragon again. He had nearly tricked her into giving her mother's life for Arthur's. Only Gaius intervening had led to her killing Nimue and restoring the balance of life and death. He had made her promise to free him when the time came, and it felt like staring down the blade of a sword, but she had no choice. She needed the spell to defeat Sigan, or he would raze Camelot to the ground. The power surging through her should burn. She felt it had burned others before, but the knowledge the dragon had imparted seemed to sing against her own magic, falling quickly into tune, a harmony running through her veins. She ran back up to the courtyard, reaching it just in time to shatter a gargoyle swooping down to attack Arthur's prone form. Racing to him, she breathed a sigh as she found a pulse beating under his skin.
Who would have guessed? You, a sorceress at the heart of Camelot, and a powerful one at that.
A voice echoed from the mist, somewhat familiar but with a metallic edge. Merlin scrambled back to her feet, placing herself between Sigan and Arthur. The body was Cedric's, but she doubted Sigan had let him continue to live in the back of his mind. "I will not let you hurt him," she practically snarled.
"Why should you stop me? He would kill you without a thought if he knew. You are little better than a slave to him. He would cast you aside without a thought."
Sigan's words were venom spewing from his tongue. "It doesn't matter," Merlin said, trying to keep her resolve.
"Of course it does. You have potential beyond my wildest imaginings. Any with the true sight can see it, you know. You have barely scratched the surface of what you're capable. I could teach you everything I know. Think, Merlin, you could have the recognition you crave. Arthur would see you for what you truly are."
Sigan said, his voice going from venomous to honeyed, almost tempting. "That can't be."
"But it could. Join me. Rule as my queen. Arthur will kneel before you, tremble at the sound of your voice,"
Sigan said, stepping forward as though already confident that he'd won. "I don't want that. I never wanted that." Merlin snarled back at him.
"You would continue as a servant the rest of your life, hiding in the shadows?"
Sigan asked, stopping in his tracks. "Better to serve a good man than to rule with an evil one." Merlin's voice was resolute. She would not be moved.
"So be it. I will become you and bend your power to my will. Perhaps I will keep you alive long enough to watch me slowly end your precious prince,"
Sigan said with a sneer, and Cedric's body shuddered, blue smoke pouring from his eyes, his nose, ears, and mouth. Merlin began to chant the spell the dragon had given her, but her words choked off as the smoke enveloped her. Gasping for air, Merlin sank to her knees. The feel of another entity in her mind was oppressive, choking, painful. She couldn't speak to finish the chant. She couldn't get enough air to remain conscious. She slumped to the cobblestones, shaking. Anyone brave enough to observe the courtyard at that moment would have been witness to an internal battle. Gold and black fought for supremacy in Merlin's eyes, and for one moment the darkness won out, void filling once blue eyes. Then a starburst of gold cracked the blackness, and blue light coalesced into a familiar heart-shaped stone. Merlin gasped for breath, coughing as though she'd been held by the throat. She managed to scramble back to her feet as Gaius stepped outside. They quickly formulated a plan. Merlin planted the stone on Cedric, careful to not let it touch his bare skin lest Sigan attempt another escape. They brought Arthur around next, and Merlin smiled as he startled awake. Their story only worked because no one else knew how magic worked. Gaius had theorized that since the stone had held Sigan captive before, it could trap him again. He'd sent Merlin down to the tomb, and she'd managed to toss the stone at the sorcerer, catching him off guard and trapping his soul once again. Merlin had to kick the old stone under a blanket on her way into the tomb to keep anyone from noticing that there were now 2 of the stones. But no one noticed. Galahad was released, and Merlin spent the night tending Arthur's wounds while he griped. Repairs on the castle would take time, and there would never be as many gargoyles as before, but no one counted that as a bad thing. Galahad found Merlin a few days later with a grin and a small wrapped package.
It's not much, but I wanted to say thank you
Galahad said, pressing the brown paper package into her hands.
for believing me and for all you do for Arthur. I know you likely spoke to him. He apologized. He never did that before you came along.
He clarified, his face going a bit red. Merlin thanked him and unwrapped the package. Inside was a new scarf. This one was forest green. Merlin grinned, thanking him with a hug. You're my friend, Galahad. I'm glad I can help, she said, tying her hair back with the new scarf. He grinned as Merlin's name echoed across the courtyard. Best get back. Arthur's been cranky since Gaius told him he needed to rest his shoulder instead of helping rebuild. She was off like a shot, and Galahad grinned after her.